Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Community Chapel. We're here today looking at Sunday school, and today we will be learning and reading about David and his young life. So, if you don't know a lot about David, he was the king of Israel after Saul, and I want to talk just about his life and who he was, and a lot of the things that he does when he's young really affect the outcome and how he behaves. We know that David was one of the greatest kings of Israel, and a lot of that greatness really took place when he had just started. So if you need a little time, maybe to just look on your phone or your Bible, we'll be reading in 1 Samuel 16. This is where David is anointed king. Starting there on verse 1, it says, "Now the Lord said to Samuel, 'How long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reign over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king among his sons.'" So, a little context here. We have Samuel, who was the prophet of Israel. He was kind of the leader and the man. Then we have the Israelites and the people saying that they didn't want him anymore, that they wanted a king, that they wanted to be like other nations. So Samuel tells them that it's not a good idea, but the people just want a king. And the Lord has told Samuel to do what the people tell him to do because they have rejected God, not Samuel. So Samuel goes ahead and lets them do their thing. He picks out Saul. And Saul, from a very young age, he doesn't seem a lot like David. He grew up with what seems to be a good economic life. There's a scripture that talks about him growing up and having a herd of donkeys. If he was a poor boy, he probably wouldn't have a herd of donkeys. So the herd of donkeys ran away, and he had to go seek them, but couldn't find them. And soon enough, he gave up. But his servant, or his teacher that was with him, wanted to keep going and trust in God. But Saul was kind of refusing a little bit. And that kind of just proves a little bit that Saul was not like David a lot. And we're going to get into more of what David did. But Samuel appoints Saul as king because the Israelites want a king. And Samuel goes and he sees that Saul is not a very good king. So now God's telling Samuel that he will appoint a second king. And there's on verse 4 of chapter 16, it says, "So Samuel did what the Lord said and went to Bethlehem. And the elders of the town trembled at his coming and said, 'Do you come peaceably?' And he said, 'Peaceably I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice.' Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. So it was, when they came, that he looked at Eliab and said, 'Surely the Lord's anointed is before him.' But the Lord said to Samuel, 'Do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. I want to stop right there and talk a little bit more about that verse, because that verse just has a lot. We see that in this, that David was not a best stature. He wasn't like a, 6'5" bodybuilder guy, or the oldest, with a beard and real rugged. But that he was actually real young, and that people would probably look down upon him. And I love what God tells him. He says, "Do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him." He's talking about the first son of the Bethlehemite there. But I love that part where it says, there on that same verse, it says, "For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." And that verse right there can apply to a lot of things. It can apply to how we judge people. It can apply to the way we act, to the way we treat people even. That we don't just look at the outside and think they are broken and hopeless, and that there's no need for prayer. Or sometimes we look at the outside and think they are high and mighty, and we think they don't need any help or don't need anything, but really they're hurting inside, or they're wanting some help inside. And I want us to try to be more, to have more perspective of potential. I had a few leadership positions, and one of the things that really helped me out when being in that leadership position that I learned was you have to look at people's potential, and you have to look past the outward appearance and into their heart and their soul. You have to see where they could excel at and where they could be better at in position. But you can't do that a lot of times just from the physical appearance. You have to get to know who they are. You have to treat them and commune with them so that you can see what's inside, and you can say, okay, this person is probably good here, or this person is really going to exceed at serving people, and this person's really going to exceed at doing office work. And I love that God just tells him that he does not see man for the outward, but for the inward. So I believe a lot of times it's so easy to look at the outward and forget about the inward. A lot of times we get offended and we get hurt, and immediately we just look at the outward, and we forget that we're talking to a soul that will eventually end up in heaven or hell, which is such a harsh reality, and we kind of downplay it a lot of times just because we get hurt and we forget about it. So God tells him that David is not going to be a mighty man in the outward. He's not going to be like a stallion. He's not going to be real big and real pretty. He's probably going to be more like a pony. David was actually the youngest of 8. And around this time, it's believed that he was actually around 10 to maybe 13 years, somewhere around there. And as we keep reading there from verse 7, starting verse 8, it says, "So Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, 'Neither has the Lord chosen this one.' So now we're in the second son, and it's not him. Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Thus Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen these." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Are all the young men here?" Then he said, "There remains yet the youngest, and there he is, keeping the sheep." So Samuel sees all the sons, and I think it's interesting how the father shows him all his sons, thinking that it's got to be one of these, yet he neglects the youngest for the end. He kind of thinks, "Oh, there's no way it's going to be him," but really it was. Kind of a Cinderella moment when Cinderella is with her sisters and she loses her shoe, right? And then the mom and the 2 daughters, or the stepmom, they go to the king and they present themselves, and she shows her daughters to the king, and she says it's got to be one of these 2, and completely neglects Cinderella, right? She leaves her off by herself, thinking that she's not worth it, that there's no way it could be her. And so we see that here with David, that even though he was working, it seems to be that he was the only one working. His dad was just kind of neglecting him and thinking there's no way it's going to be him. But then Samuel knows that it's not him, so he goes and he asks him for the last one. And there in verse 12 it goes on to say, "So he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, with bright eyes, and good looking. And the Lord said, 'Arise, anoint him, for this is the one.'" I would really love to know how the Lord spoke to Samuel in that moment and told him that. If it was kind of a thought or if it was audibly. That'd be kind of crazy if, everybody heard the voice of God say that. So I really would, I don't know how he told him that exactly, but he tells him that this is the one. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel arose and went to Ramah. So keep in mind that David is anointed king, and we said he was around 10 to 13 at this time. Then we go on, and David was anointed. So on verse 18, David becomes the servant of Saul because he is anointed king. And in verse 18 it says, "Then one of the servants answered and said, 'Look, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a mighty man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a handsome person, and the Lord is with him.'" So here the servant is talking about David. And I think it's interesting how David was seen as not really a man of valor, just a boy tending the sheep. Yet after God anoints him, God brings him into the light. And I like that God has the ability to humble people and also exalt him in the right situation. Because it took humbleness of David tending the sheep so that he could become a great king. And then when it was a time of exalting so that he could be in the kingdom and around Saul, then the Lord exalted him in man's eyes. So wherever you are, don't feel neglected, don't feel down that perhaps you're not in the position you are or you had hoped for, because God does have a timing. He has a plan, and we just have to try to align ourselves with that plan. A lot of the times we don't know what that plan exactly looks like, but we get a small glimpse of it, and it is so much greater than that. David had no idea that he would become what he was after he was king. So I like how God exalts David in man's eyes in a way. Before he wasn't exalting him in man's eyes, but now he is exalted. So then there in verse 19 it says, "Therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, 'Send me your son David, who is with the sheep.' So Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them by his son David to Saul. David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. Then Saul sent to Jesse, saying, 'Please let David stand before me, for he has found favor in my sight.'" So here in the beginning, Saul sees David. He sees that he's a great kid, that he's probably got a kind heart, and he's a good player. He's just a great servant, and it's pleasing to Saul. So then it goes, "So it was whenever the Spirit from God was upon Saul, that David would take a harp and play with his hand. Then Saul would become refreshed and well, and the distressing spirit would depart from him." So I don't know how or if Saul had a distressing spirit from a young age, because like I said, Saul didn't have a very close relationship with God like David did. And David was a real man of God, a man after God's own heart, and God himself said that about David, which is a wow factor, right? We probably all, it would be an honor to have that title. And so then we go on to chapter 17, and this is where David fights Goliath. David is a little older now, and he's serving for King Saul. He's just serving at this point. What I love about David is that there's nothing really special that he did. He just simply just served people. He was just obedient, whether it was tending sheep, whether it was taking food to his brothers, whether it was playing the harp. He just simply obeyed, and that obedience just keeps exalting him and taking him to higher places more and more each time. So, and I want to talk real quick about how a lot of times one small sin will lead to another sin, and then to another sin, and eventually you got this snowball of sins. Well, I believe that the same thing can apply to obedience. How if we are obedient in one thing, one small thing, that it will cause another act of obedience. Just how David was obedient in keeping the sheep for his father. He was obedient in being a servant and taking the bread and the wine to King Saul. And from that obedience, he was obedient to playing the harp, and he did it well. So a lot of times, remember that one simple act of obedience can be like your keystone. It's something that you do and something that inspires you to do something of that same kind. And there in chapter 17, we have David. He's serving, just being obedient to King Saul. And they're fighting the Philistines. Now at that time, it was kind of medieval times. So we had one side here and one side here, and they would just kind of have a standoff of who shoots first. And Goliath is standing there between the two armies, and he's challenging them. He's saying, "Let one man come to me and we'll fight one-on-one to determine the whole battle. Because part of it was that you don't want to waste so many lives for one battle. So if you can just sacrifice one person for another and determine the whole battle, it would save so many other lives. And we kind of see that in a way also with Jesus, how one lamb overcame everybody, died for everybody. And this is the same thing that's happening here, is that one person from each side would go and basically sacrifice themselves, knowing that they might win or they might lose, but they're doing it for everybody else. And Jesus Christ was that one person that stepped out and said, I will do it. I will suffer for everybody behind me, for you and I included. So Goliath is there. He's challenging somebody, and nobody's stepping up. Everybody's not confident, right? He's a huge, really big guy, giant. And David just simply goes over, and he takes some bread to his brothers that are in the war now, there to feed him. He hears about this, and he asks them. So he asks them what's going on, and his brothers kind of neglect him a little bit. In one of the times, David asked his brothers what's going on, and they're kind of like, oh, well, what do you know, or what do you want now? And it is there on chapter 17, verse 28. It says, now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the man, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David. Eliab was mad because David went and talked to some of the other guys there and found out what was happening. So he was envied in a way. He was envious and jealous that David went and did that. And he tells David, he said, why did you come down here, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. So quickly his oldest brother is judging him, and he's just putting negative words to him. He's trying to tell him he's prideful. He's seeing everything that's negative. And that's just from a heart issue, that Eliab didn't really love his brother. He always saw the worst in him. But listen, if you are a Christian, you should always try to see the best in people. And that kind of goes back to that whole thing of judging, seeing deeper than just the outside. Eliab was quick to judge, and he judged that David was being prideful and arrogant, being kind of a gossip guy, if you will. But really, he just kind of wanted to know what was going on. He was just being curious. And there in verse 29, David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? So David's kind of like, what now? So we see that this is probably not the first time that this has happened. They continue to maybe bicker a little bit, and Saul ends up hearing about David wanting to fight Goliath. And finally, Saul sees David. He knows David, and he tells him, okay, he says, you want to do it? The Lord will deliver you into him. He's like, take this armor, take all this stuff and go ahead. But David says, no, this armor is too big on me. It's too heavy. And he goes out just with his, I believe, lyre, kind of like a sling, and a rock. Just a few smooth rocks. And David says in verse 26, he says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine who defies the Lord? So immediately David's like, this guy he's just a chump. who is he, right? Then later on, verse 37, he says that God will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. Then in verse 46, he says, the Lord will deliver you unto my hand. He tells that to Goliath. And then verse 47, David says again, he will give you into our hands, talking about the Philistines. So David is real confident in the Lord. He knows that these guys are evil and that they're opposite of God. So he proclaims that throughout this whole chapter here. So then they go to fight. Goliath tries to strike him, but he's too slow. David just slings a rock at his forehead, knocks him out. Or maybe he killed him. We don't know, but David is like, I got to make sure. So he goes over, takes a sword from Goliath, and cuts his head off. Then he takes the head to Saul and presents it to him. Now, remember that David is probably like my age around this time, maybe a little bit younger. So he's going through a lot for a young age. He's got some great boldness. But that boldness didn't come just from within himself. It came from the Lord, because he said, God will deliver you into our hands. God will deliver you into my hands as well. And it's all about God. He's not relying on himself. His boldness didn't come from himself, but from God, from who God is and from what God has spoken. Because God had already told him that he would give him the kingdom. And after that, after he kills Goliath, the people start doing songs about David and how great he is. They say Saul killed 1,000, but David killed 10,000. And Saul becomes jealous of this, and he gets mad at David now. He becomes envious and tries to kill him several times. One time he threw a spear at him directly. And David, even though somebody throws a spear at him, he's still serving them. Imagine right now if your boss at work got a gun and tried to shoot you and missed you. Now, would you go back to work and would you stay there? Most of you, I assume, would say no. But David just kept serving there. And that's literally what Saul did. He tried to kill him, and David just kept serving. He stayed there. And then a little fast forward, David starts kind of getting away from Saul, because Saul is really wanting to kill him now at this point. But David knows that the Lord has delivered the kingdom to him. He's been anointed for it. And one of the times Saul is sleeping, and David has a chance to kill him. He has a chance to kill his oppressor, yet he chooses not to. And then another time, Saul is looking for him in a cave, and David cuts off a piece of his clothing and sends it to him and shows him that, hey, I could have killed you, but I didn't. You know, kind of like the ultimate respect but goodness. And that right there just shows how good, wise, and merciful David is. And God said, David is a man after my own heart. And that act of mercy is just that. You know, Jesus said, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And it's also there in Hosea, a prophecy. And it's very difficult when to strike, when to discern when to strike, and when to have mercy. And I think David did a great example of that. And through this whole time, he was just patient. It's very difficult to discern when you should just do it and withhold. For example, when David, he knew that he had to cut the head of Goliath, he immediately did it. But he also knew that Saul had been anointed by God to be king. And so he shows mercy to Saul and withholds. And so if through your life, just know when to withhold a little bit, when to restrain. And I think that's a great step in maturity that will open up so many doors for you. Just that discernment of knowing when to do so and when to not. Because here, what it did to David, he was patient and he waited for the Lord. And he just loved everybody. So then finally, around the time he was 30, David finally became king. So from the time he was anointed, 10 or 13, to the time he actually became king was 30. So he had to wait about 17 or 20 years to see the promise of God. So in whichever situation, whatever season you're in right now, just remember to keep following God. Just remain patient and really stay in connection with God so that you know when to do something and when to not. And that kind of sums up our lesson for today. So thank you for listening. Thank you for being attentive. And we're just going to pray real quick about the story. Lord, thank you for this day. God, help us be more like you. Break our hearts for what breaks yours. Lord, as we go out, just be with us. Continue to speak to us and guide us each and every day. We love you, and we thank you for your sacrifice, Jesus. Amen.